Before I jump into the story today, I have two things for us to keep in mind. The first is that our faith itself is given to us as a story, which is not to say that it's a tale told so that we can learn very particular moral lessons, which is not to say that there aren't some moral lessons to learn. It's just that that's not what the story is about. It's a story that instead is supposed to weave its way into our lives and leave us with some company that enables us to engage in questions and wonderments. There are a multiplicity of meanings from any story of faith, and that's no different from today's story. So my work today was really about trying to give you the story with a little bit more flesh on it so that you might take it with you and enjoy keeping Anna and Simeon with you this week. The second is to share one of the things that you'll hear in the story. It's a comment a colleague of mine made, and that is that this story shows up a generational challenge. Anna and Simeon are like faithful church-goers of old, and Jesus, properly baptized, presented, and confirmed, shows up at the temple at the age of 30 and is distinctly unimpressed. My friend commented, "He's just like a millennial." And indeed, there may be some wisdom in that. So you may hear a bit of that in today's story. Faithfully, Anna spent her days and nights at the temple. It was an exaggeration, actually, to say that she never left, for even the priests did not live at the temple. They had quarters nearby that they used during their terms of service. Still, Anna was there every day for long days, early and late. A modest living could be eked out for those employed by the priests, helping to welcome people and organize folks as they came in to make their sacrifice, whose offering would be taken next into the Holy of Holies, and then cleaning up after people finished eating their burnt offerings, which is to say cooked offerings, at the end of the day, picking up the bones and whatever else was left behind and scrubbing the stones clean from the greasy drippings. The priests liked to employ those who, like Anna, conveyed a sense of reverence, often stopping to pray by herself or with others who came and went. The temple was the center of her life, and while she could not enter the Holy of Holies, or even the court of Israel, she could wander through the court of the Gentiles, the outermost courts of the temple, and then up the stairs through the east gate into the women's court, named so only because it was the last court that women could go into. Men were there as well. The men were allowed to go through the gate of Nicanor into the court of Israel, which was next to the court of the priests, where sacrifices were made and offerings were taken into the heart of the temple, the holy place, the Holy of Holies, and there offered to God. When she arrived early, each day, it was still a little quiet, long shadows keeping the courtyards half shaded. In the court of the Gentiles, the money changers would be arriving to set up their tables, and the farmers with baskets of grains, jugs of oil, there to sell them, others corralling lambs or goats or calves, and still others hauling cages of turtle doves or pigeons. And as each harvest came, some would carry dates or figs or olives or apricots. In this way, those who traveled from afar could come into the court of the Gentiles and purchase what they needed for sacrifice right there. Early, the priest's servants arrived carrying wood and charcoal to start the fires of sacrifice, and then the first of the priests and the scribes, on their way through the north or south gates, they could go directly to the court of priests that way. Anna loved this part of the morning while it was still a little quiet, crossing the court of Gentiles slowly, greeting merchants who long had been her friends, some of them tucking away a few stores for her to pick up at the end of the day, a beautiful piece of fruit or some grain, and in exchange she prayed for them or ensured that their offerings would be taken early to the Holy of Holies. After all, Anna was known by many and admired for her faithfulness, praying even while performing all the tasks that enable the temple to be a place of worship for so many. And to add to that, the respect held for her, she is, after all, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. Many in the temple know of her as a prophet. Entering the court of women, Anna would greet the earlier arrivers, those most eager to make those offerings or to show themselves for purification, husbands and wives carrying newborns, lepers tucked into the lepers' court, the offering for those who had sinned. Well, they tended to come later in the day when the crowds thinned and neighbors were less likely to be seen. Usually Simeon, another one of those who was often at the temple, would show up every week or so around mid-morning, and righteousness was reckoned to him. He could have gone straight into the court of Israel, but he usually came in by the east gate too and greeted Anna. Strange man. He had been told in a dream once years before that he would not die until he saw the salvation of Israel. Simeon walked through the gate of Nicanor, through which Anna could hear the men, the scribes, the Levites, the Pharisees, starting their recitation of the scrolls, telling of the stories to one another, arguing over the Torah. And it was just such a day in Anna's 84th year. It was bustling in the court of the women. Many family groups sat in circles to consume their early morning offerings, others walking directly to the trumpet-shaped receptacles of the treasury after they had exchanged their ordinary coins, those engraved with political or mythological figures and therefore not accepted in the temple. So they changed them for a little rate in order to make the offerings in these trumpet-shaped receptacles. Some made elaborate motions while making their offerings, others surreptitiously dropping a few coins and then moving away to pray in a quiet corner. Still others only now arriving to make their rites of purification or to offer gifts to the priest, to seek Anna's direction where the women should sit and wait for the men, and where the men should go in order to find the priests or their porters in order to give them the offerings which would be taken and then returned. That day, shortly after the sun had passed its apex, in came a man and a woman with a baby. They had two tasks to accomplish: to present their son in the temple and to do the required rites of purification that were required for women after childbirth. From some distance, Anna can see their purpose. In the man's hand are two young pigeons, and from this she knows the couple is poor, as the law actually calls for the offering of a lamb, but makes provisions that those without means might substitute two birds. The couple walk right up towards the gate of Nicanor, and there it all happens. Suddenly, the child shines. It's hard to describe, for it was a light not perceived with her eyes, but with something of the substance of trust. Shaped by her love of God, she knows something of the Holy of Holies, how it resides more strongly in some than others, how it comes from within as if an indwelling Torah. And even while this perception is strumming her inward being, her heart expanding and her voice beginning to take flight in praise of God, she hears Simeon, his voice just coming through the gate, his face alight with the same perception, his voice extolling, "Now you release your servant in peace, Master, in keeping with your word, for my eyes have seen the salvation which you have made ready before the face of all peoples, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and glory for your people Israel." The child only seems to delight in the voices which are entering on either side of him, while his parents pause. They seem, well, a little surprised, but also amused. It's like it's a family joke. And Simeon walks through the gate into the women's court and steps right up to the mother. Anna shudders at his words. The sweetness of his previous song is now mixed with burnt tones. "Look," he says, "this one is appointed for the fall and rise of many in Israel, and as a sign that it will be spoken against, and your own soul a sword will pierce, so that many considerations of the heart may be revealed." Anna sees to the mother as if she is an honored guest, finding a good place for her to wait while her husband and child are brought through the gate and into the court of Israel by Simeon. Anna's heart is bursting with prayer. The mother, young though she may be, is exceptionally welcoming of these words of praise, joining in holy wonder along with Anna's own words. It was all over too soon. The father and son back with two cooked birds, a meal, graciously thanking Anna and Simeon for their help. And then Simeon, true to his prophecy, was dead the next day. Eventually, Anna too began to be too old to do her work at the temple, to manage the stairs, and she disappeared from inside those quiet walls, joining Simeon in the earth, in the stories that shape our faith. And 30 years later, when this child comes back to the temple, he is distinctly unimpressed with much of what he sees. He will rail against the temple rules that subject the poor to usurious fees. The priests whose notion of cleanliness goes beyond God's intention for simply shaping a ritual. The priests start interpreting it as sin and guilt. The scribes and Pharisees who eagerly study the letter of the law but show little capacity to interpret it with any holy compassion or with a sense of God's beautiful order. It takes a lifetime of being shaped by the Word of God, by prayer and ritual, by days in the temple to recognize the holy in our midst. But strangely, the Christ who we recognize is the one who will teach us to reorder the very religious institutions in which we have invested. Are we shaped enough to see Christ in our midst? Can we see him shine? Can we spot him here? Can we see the Christ who is unimpressed by our Sunday morning doings and instead is walking the streets of Portland, feeding the immigrants, speaking of hope, comforting the drug addicted, the mentally ill, keeping company with parents who are watching their children play soccer even on a Sunday, offering to care for the young whose anxiety about climate change, gun violence, and the possibility of making a meaningful working wage is significant. The temple will be destroyed, never again to be rebuilt. But Jesus, who walks among us, he needs no temple. We keep building temples, cathedrals, churches, all to the glory of God. Still, Jesus will not be thus contained. He is moving about in the world. See how he shines.